We invite you to stay tuned for the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church, located at 271 Mayfield Drive, Smyrna, Tennessee. We will now join the service.
All right, we welcome you back again to our Mayfield Drive Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study, and we are continuing in our study of the Apostle Paul, and we are looking at we will conclude the first missionary journey that Paul and Barnabas took. We'll finish that up tonight, Lord willing. Our text verse comes from Acts chapter 14, beginning with verse 19. And there came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium, who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. Howbeit, as the disciples stood round about him, he rose up and came into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. And when they had preached the gospel to that city and had taught many, they returned again to Lystra and to Iconium and Antioch, confirming the souls of the disciples and exhorting them to continue in the faith, and that we must through much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God. And when they had ordained them elders in every church and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord, on whom they believed. So in the last part, we saw Paul and Barnabas were barely able to keep the people from Lystra from offering sacrifices to them as gods. So we can be certain that there were many of the city of Lystra that were saved, because later Paul returned to Lystra to continue teaching the disciples there. Now, we're going to find that Paul was stoned at Lystra. Things might have been good had not certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium arrived in Lystra to take care of Paul. He had been run out of Antioch and Iconium for preaching the gospel. And this was to be a pattern throughout his entire ministry, would happen to him over and over again. Apparently, word of what was happening in Lystra had reached the ears of the Jews who were responsible for running him out of those two cities. They were determined that Paul would not continue to preach the gospel to any others. When they arrived at Lystra, they persuaded the people of Lystra that Paul was a troublemaker who continually stirred up trouble wherever he went. Well, in their view, I guess he would have been a troublemaker. It was not hard to persuade those who felt offended that Paul and Barnabas had rejected their offering of sacrifice to them. You will recall the people of Lystra, or many of them anyway, were saying that they were gods and they wanted to worship and sacrifice to them, but they barely persuaded them not to. They felt that it was an affront to them and their gods. So it wasn't difficult to really get them up in arms. There's no doubt that the priest of Jupiter became a ringleader with the Jews in rising up against Paul and Barnabas. To refuse the sacrifice caused the priest to lose face with the people. So he was going to do whatever he could to right that wrong. Okay? He probably had his ego probably took a few blows in that. Well, what do you mean surprising? Here, we're about to honor you and you refuse? Yeah, he probably got pretty upset. So thus, this crowd became an incited mob who took Paul and began to stone him. They repeatedly stoned him while inciting other of the crowd to do the same. For Paul, it was a repeat of history of many years past when it was he who had incited the Jews to stone Deacon Stephen. And I wondered if that went through his mind as he was being stoned. Some might say that he was only getting what he had deserved, but this was part of the suffering that Paul would undergo in his service for the Lord. Now, I want to pause right here for just a moment. Some say that Paul was stoned more than once, but he was not. This was the only stoning, at least that I can find. There were attempts to stone him, other attempts, but this was the only one that seemed to take place. So hopefully I won't have to go back and correct myself as we go on in the study. But from what it appears now, this was the only time that Paul was actually stoned. The stoning stopped when it appeared that Paul was dead. In reality, Paul was unconscious. He was dragged through the streets to the outskirts of the city of Lystra. And who was it? Was it Mark, I think, that was also dragged and died before he got to the place of stoning or where he was going to be killed? I think it was Mark. I think it was Mark, but don't quote me on that. I couldn't. Yeah, yes. Barnabas and the disciples gathered around the still form of Paul. Instead of being dead, as they feared, Paul regained consciousness and stood up. One historian that I was reading said that God had to resurrect Paul because he wasn't finished with him yet. I don't think that was the case. I think Paul was, it is very reasonable that Paul was unconscious. But it wouldn't be unreasonable that he would be dead, but I don't think God knew what he was doing, okay? Huh?
That's a medical thing that's only been in the last couple of 100 years.
Yes. Here he is not moving when he's being hit. You know, his body is not responding to other stones hitting him. So, logically, those looking on or those participating in the stoning would think, okay, we can stop now, he's dead.
To look at the scripture and to read it, you see that he really wasn't dead. They supposed he was dead. So
Right.
that was an indication.
Right.
He wasn't dead. And so, like I said, he's unconscious.
Yep. Maybe he wasn't even unconscious. Maybe he was just pretending although it would have been hard to, I think. But
God protected him.
God protected him. And that's my point. God would not have allowed him to die when he already had Paul's life planned out for him. You remember back when Paul finally, excuse me, there in Damascus, it was revealed to Paul, later on, what his ministry was going to be about and how long that it would take the rest of his life. God wouldn't allow him to die when he already had this plan for him. All right? So protecting him, absolutely. So that he wouldn't die, absolutely. Look at all the times that Paul's life was in a threat. Natural things, he mentioned, what was it, in 1 Corinthians, I think, that he mentioned many of those. We'll look at those as we get on further in. So they returned to the city. He stood up and went into the city and spent the night. And the next day, Paul and Barnabas departed to Derbe, a distance of about 60 miles. Now, you see in your notes the map that I have in there. We don't have a picture of it with the slides, but we do.
You just don't see it.
Oh, I just don't see it.
Turn around. Flip there.
Ah, okay. Good. Good. So you see all the cities and the places that we're talking about. This was the extent of Paul's first missionary journey. You see where Antioch and Pisidia is. They were run out of Antioch, so they went to Iconium. And then from Iconium, they were run out. They went to Lystra. Well, in Lystra, Paul was stoned because Jews from Antioch and then Iconium joined together, went down to Lystra, excuse me, to take care of the situation that this fellow was doing. So Jews were always a thorn in Paul's side. And I don't think that's the thorn that he was talking about in the flesh. But that's a lot of traveling there. We'll look at that later on. So we look at Derbe now. The Eastern Asia Minor city of Derbe, along with Iconium and Lystra, was located in the southern part of the Roman province of Galatia. The residents of the city spoke a different language from those located north of Iconium. Derbe's location in the far eastern part of the province made it the last city on a road that heads east that was within distinctively Roman territory. Commerce and trade entering the city and going west were required to pay customs fees. The Apostle Paul visited the city during his first, his second, and his third missionary journeys. All three of his journeys, he made a stop in Derbe. And I think you'll see why in just a little bit. It was one of...
On that slide,
Yes.
those in the audience are seeing a picture, and those online are seeing a picture of the New Testament church Lystra, Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, Paphos, Salamis, Tarsus. I found that on the BibleStudy.org site where you got that quote from.
Okay, I saw that and I didn't put it in there. I did reserve that though. It was going to be used. I would go back to that. Well, thank you for putting that in there. That gives us a little. It's easier to see. We can talk about it, we can read it, but then when you see a map, it makes it a little bit easier to relate to. It was one of the 4 cities in the eastern part of Asia Minor, not including his hometown of Tarsus. He visited at least 3 times during his ministry. Derbe was also hometown of a man named Gaius, Gaius, who was one of several people that accompanied him on the last half of his 3rd journey. That's according to Acts 20 and verse number 4. Paul had an exceptionally perilous path just to visit Derbe for the first time. Now, but before I go to this slide, we said a while ago that Derbe was about 60 miles from Lystra. Well, if you recall, we've determined that a day's journey, according to the Romans, was approximately 20 miles. So it would theoretically take them 3 days at least to travel from Lystra to Derbe. Didn't just get there right quick. And most of the time they were walking. In Pisidia Antioch, his effective and successful preaching so angered the Jews that they got those in power to expel him from the city. And we read that in Acts 13:45 through 50. He then, traveling east, goes to Iconium. Once again, his evangelistic success so infuriates the Jews in the city that they assault him with plans to stone him to death. That's chapter 14, 1 through 6. Now, they planned it, but Paul and Barnabas heard about it before they were able to carry it out. Fleeing again, he and Barnabas make it to Lystra. Paul's healing of a crippled man in Lystra initially brings adulation from the city. Jews from Antioch and Iconium, however, soon show up and stir up the people against the 2 apostles. He is then literally stoned to death and dragged outside the city. God inspires him to finally make it to Derbe, and no doubt strengthened him so that he could make it. The city provides a far less tumultuous evangelistic atmosphere than the previous areas he and Barnabas visited. In fact, it was the only location in Galatia where Paul, during his first journey anyway, was able to preach with relative peace and start a new church. All right, all of that was a quote, and that was my source. So according to the Roman calculation of a day's journey, it would have taken them approximately 3 days to reach Derbe. When they arrived there, they began to preach the gospel to the city. Derbe was one place that they were not given any trouble in spreading the gospel. Now, they probably thought they were having a vacation just being able to preach and teach and not to have it deal with anybody getting mad at you and trying to kill you.
Always a good time.
Absolutely. It appears from Scripture that a great many people were saved and the church was started there.
You mean it did take them 20 years?
No, sir, it did not.
What's wrong with that picture?
Later, a man named Gaius appears in the Scriptures as helping Paul in the ministry. His name appears in several different places. It seems evident that he may have been one of the first disciples made there at that time. You can find him named in Acts 20, verse 4, Romans 16, verse 23, and 3 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 14.
Gaius was the one who John was writing to
Yes, he was.
about theopathy.
Yes.
Whatever the guy's name, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the troublemaker.
Yes, the troublemaker. You're right. So not only were they successful in preaching the gospel there in Derby, but they were also able to remain with the new disciples and to teach them. This may have been one of the churches in Galatia to whom the book of Galatians was later written. Now, that's my determination, okay? So you might prove me wrong, but I doubt it. All right, we are given no hint of the amount of time they were able to spend in Derby, but evidently long enough to be able to ground the disciples there and to be able to leave them in good stead. Now, Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch again. You would think that they would think twice about going back into those cities that were so hostile to them. But that wasn't the way Paul and Barnabas operated. When they finished in Derby, Paul and Barnabas returned to Lystra. Now, as a side note, I didn't put that in your notes, Lystra is the hometown of Timothy. We'll cover that in the second journey. They seem to have been able to teach and train the disciples there without any interference of the Jews. Number one, when they finished Paul off, they probably went back home. The troublesome Jews had probably returned to their home cities after, quote unquote, taking care of Paul and his work. And we got rid of him, got rid of that nuisance. They may have been, quote unquote, undercover while there, because there is no record of any trouble while they were in the teaching phase of the work there. Because of what had happened on their previous visit, others might not have returned to these cities, but that was not how Paul and Barnabas operated. There had not been time for them to teach and to train the new disciples in those cities before they were forced to flee. All they were able to do was to win them to the Lord and see them saved. They didn't have time to do anything else. There had not been time. That was basically what I said in that slide, wasn't it? Verse 22 relates to us that they remained long enough in each city to be able to ground the disciples so they could continue to labor in their home area after Paul and Barnabas were gone. Acts 14:23. When they had ordained them elders in every church and had fasted and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they believed. This verse relates to us that Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for each congregation of the cities of Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe. Now we should note that there is no office of elders in or is known in the New Testament church, but there appears to have been a plurality of elders, mature, morally, ethically, doctrinally sound brethren, set apart as teachers and leaders in each church. From these, it is believed that each church then selected pastors and deacons for the offices of church administration. And that source was Dr. Garner on his comments on verse 23. That's not a quote, but he's the source of the material. Also, this verse we see the complete cycle of the Great Commission being carried out. First, disciples were made in each instance. Baptism is not mentioned in any of the verses. But can we believe that Paul and Barnabas would have neglected this part of the commission? No. Indeed, we cannot. It is understood that these new disciples would have been baptized and then taught. Because of the resistance that was encountered by Paul and Barnabas, they may not have been able to have baptized the disciples in some of the cities before they were forced to flee. But we can be certain that that would have been done. That would have been the first thing they would have done upon their return to each city. I think I did too. That's my writing, so yeah. We can be certain in saying that by the time Paul and Barnabas had left each location where there were disciples, there were established, trained, and fully functioning New Testament churches left behind to carry on. Now let's look at the return to Antioch in Syria. Again, Acts 14, beginning with verse 24. And after they had passed throughout Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia. And when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down into Attalia, and thence sailed to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work which they fulfilled. And when they were come and had gathered the church together, they rehearsed all that God had done with them, and how he had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. And there they abode long time with the disciples. So having traversed the rugged and dangerous regions of Pisidia and Pamphylia, Paul and Barnabas made their way to Perga, where they preached the gospel. When they first got to Perga on their way inland, they did not seem to stay long enough to preach. Upon their return, however, they remained long enough to do so. We're given no information that there was a church established in Perga on the return trip. Were there no disciples made in Perga? It would appear that would be the case. Otherwise, they would have remained to establish a church there. Now, we are given no indication in the scriptures that any were saved in Perga. Okay? They did otherwise, they would have remained long enough to take care of that and to establish a church. So they preached the gospel, and apparently none responded, which is not unusual even today. They went down to the seaport town of Attalia, some 16 miles across the plain toward the Mediterranean Sea. There they caught a ship and continued on their way to Antioch, Syria, some 300 miles south of Antioch, Pisidia. If you're wondering what the word Ibid means, it means it's the same source that I used before, just before it. Okay. Saves a lot of writing. Upon their arrival in Antioch, Syria, the Antioch church gathered together to hear the report of their missionaries. They had fulfilled the work that was given to them when they departed hence. They fulfilled their missionary tasks. They did not fall by the wayside, quit, or turn back because of difficulties. And as the first missionary journey of Paul is concluded, it appears that a time review of his mission and educational work is proper. Number one, about AD 44, he and Barnabas visited Jerusalem on behalf of the Antioch church in Syria to carry relief aid, according to Acts 11, verses 27 through 30. When they returned from Jerusalem to Antioch in Syria, they had with them John Mark, Acts 12, verses 24 and 25. Their first missionary journey was made AD 45-46, as recounted in Acts 13, 1 through 14, 28. Paul appears to have remained in Antioch of Syria for about 3 years, until after the Jerusalem Council, before starting his second major missionary journey about AD 50 or 52. It's Acts 15, verses 30 through 41. So in conclusion, any questions or comments before we wind this up this evening? Okay. So in conclusion then, we cannot know for certain just how long that Paul and Barnabas were gone on the first journey. Some say it was only months, 6 to 9. Yet the majority of scholars and historians say that it was close to 2 years that they were gone. How far did they travel? Well, again, there's no sure way of knowing. Some would say they walked over 1,400 miles, plus the sea voyages. Now, that would have to have been an estimate, of course, because the Roman mile is about, what was it? over 100 yards shorter than our mile. I can't remember for sure if that's 100 yards is correct or not. But anyway, theirs is, it's not substantial, but it would add up. So what we can say for sure is that the trip was very hard and dangerous. But they did not even think of giving up. How many people were saved? We will only know in eternity. Were there churches organized? Yes, indeed there were. There were at least 5, maybe 6, that were started and were actively involved in carrying out the Great Commission, just as they had been taught by Paul and Barnabas. Now that is counting on the island of Cyprus as well. So in the next part, we'll look at the time they spent before journey number 2. Any questions, remarks, comments?
You've been listening to the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church in Smyrna, Tennessee. We invite you to tune in at the same time next Wednesday evening for another live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study. We would love to see your comments regarding this broadcast. You may email us at imbr@imbmpodcast.com. That's imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Or you may write to us at International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. That's International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. Thank you for listening, and may you have a blessed day.